In part three of Kafka's The Metamorphosis, the main character, Gregor, who has been turned into a bug, has finally really become impacted by his isolation and his transformation. He is sleeping way less than he was. At this point, he's eating almost nothing. He's quicker to agitate maybe than he was before. He does notice this about himself, and he's beginning to be upset more at the poor treatment that he's receiving, although he still is very deferential to the needs of his family, and he's understanding how much of an inconvenience that he is to the family as a whole. In a rare moment of reflection, Gregor begins to think about a return to normal, and he's reminiscing on a past that is gone and that will never come again. But even his reminiscing has this quality of mundanity and ordinariness that he's thinking about. He's remembering his boss and some of the people he worked with and sort of ordinary things like that, as opposed to some of the wild fantasies that often get made up in our deepest memories that we wished would have happened or that we are especially proud of happening. Kafka has Gregor thinking here, saying, quote, Gregor spent his nights and days almost entirely without sleeping. Sometimes he thought about taking the family's affairs in hand again, just as he used to. The next time his door was opened, once more his boss and the general manager would appear before his mind's eye after all this time. The clerks and apprentices, the dull-witted hired man, 2 or 3 friends from other firms, a chambermaid from a provincial hotel, a sweet, fleeting specter, the shop girl from a haberdashery whom he had courted earnestly but too slowly. All of these now appeared to him, interspersed with strangers or people already forgotten. But instead of coming to his aid and that of his family, every last one of them was unapproachable, and he was glad when they disappeared. End quote. As Gregor is miserable and reminiscing locked up in his room, the family is continuing with this tolerance phase, and they're learning to live with Gregor. The sister Greta is maintaining her role as Gregor's primary caregiver. Every now and then the mom even comes in to try to clean the room, although the sister sees it as her duty, maybe selfishly preventing others from helping Gregor themselves, perhaps because she wants to be the one to control the situation. But you might also see it as this was a person who wasn't really doing a whole lot, potentially, before Gregor was transformed, and now she sees it as her thing to be the one to help Gregor. Either way, the father maintains his role as firmly anti having a bug in his house. They even hire a cleaning woman to do some things around the house, and she regards him almost like a spectacle. She's not really afraid or horrified of him, but she appreciates the absurdity of what he is at this point. And by the way, a reader might wonder how the family has the money to hire a cleaning woman. And it's at this point in the story where it's revealed that the father has gone back to work. The sister has gone to work part-time, I believe, and the family's financial situation is not really as dire as it seemed. In fact, it's implied a little bit that the father had some money, perhaps from Gregor, perhaps not. But remember, all this time, Gregor thought that his financial contributions were the thing that was keeping the family fed and the thing that was keeping the household together and the thing that was keeping the family together. But it turns out the rest of the family, seemingly personally and financially, is almost doing better off without him. And as the family continues to grow, they bring in a couple of renters who are going to rent out one of the rooms, and they need to do something about all the clutter in the house. So Gregor's room continues to change, So it's not just him changing, but now it's his room changing as well. And the family begins to place all of the storage clutter into his room. So at this point, he has no room to move. There's a couple of passages that describe him as sort of stumbling and bumbling around. He's falling down. He's got nowhere to move. All of the dust from the furniture is just covering him. And if he was monstrous before, now he's really turning into just a hideous sight to behold. At this point, he is sad and tired, and eventually he stops to think about the simple things in life, thinking about how difficult it is for him to eat and how nice it was to simply have teeth. Here he is kind of sadly listening in on his family and the three renters having a meal. And he says, quote, "It struck Gregor as peculiar that amid all the various sounds of this meal, one could also make out their chomping teeth, as if to demonstrate to Gregor that a person needs teeth to eat, and even the most splendid jaws, if toothless, can accomplish nothing at all. I'm hungry," Gregor said sorrowfully to himself, "but not for these things. Just look how these lodgers take their nourishment while I am wasting away." End quote. Perhaps Gregor here is thinking about all the things in his life that he took for granted, and when he says that he's hungry for something, not food, maybe he's hungry for some of that spiritual nourishment that he was avoiding during his life as a traveling salesman, where he was just concerned with money and doing the same day-to-day operations, getting through the day in a mundane and simple way. And maybe now he wishes he had taken some time away for himself. Anyway, at this point, the family will leave the door open for him, but sometimes he doesn't even want to look out the door anymore, and he doesn't want to listen in. But one night, his sister is encouraged to play the violin and have a musical performance in front of the three people that are renting out the room in Gregor's apartment. Now, the renters are not impressed with the way that she's playing music, but for Gregor, this is just an incredible moment. He probably hasn't heard his sister play in the longest time. And remember, it was Gregor's intention to take the sister to the conservatory and maybe foster and encourage that musical talent. And this was something that he loved about her and that connected the two of them together. So Gregor sneaks out into the living room and he's listening and maybe even trying to make encouraging eye contact with the sister. Remember that the renters are kind of bored with the performance, and Gregor wants to encourage her to keep her confidence up and keep her playing. He knows he probably shouldn't do this, and he even considers it inconsiderate, but he really wants to encourage her. Kafka captures this human moment, saying, quote, "It appeared more than clear they had been disappointed in their expectation of hearing beautiful or entertaining violin music, and now, tired of the whole performance, were continuing to tolerate this disturbance of their peace only out of politeness. Particularly the way in which all of them were blowing the smoke of their cigars high into the air from their noses and mouths suggested extreme agitation. And yet, his sister's playing was so lovely. Her face was tilted to one side, searchingly, sadly. Her eyes followed the lines of notes. Gregor crept a bit farther forward and ducked his head down close to the floor so as perhaps to catch her eye. Was he a beast that music so moved him? He felt as if he were being shown the way to that unknown nourishment he craved. He was determined to creep all the way up to his sister, to pluck at her skirt and in this way indicate to her that she should come to his room with her violin, for no one here was rewarding her playing as he meant to reward her. He would not allow her to leave his room ever again, at least as long as he was alive. His horrific figure, for the first time ever, would be useful to him. He would be at all the doors of his room at once, growling at his attackers. But his sister should remain with him not by force, but of her own free will. She should sit beside him on the settee, bend down, the better to hear, and he would confess to her that he'd had the firm intention of sending her to the conservatory, and that if the disaster had not disrupted his plans, he would have made a general announcement last Christmas. Christmas had passed now, hadn't it? Without letting himself be swayed by objections of any sort. After this declaration, his sister would be moved to the point of tears, and Gregor would raise himself to the height of her armpit and kiss her throat, which, now that she went to the office every day, she wore free of ribbon or collar. End quote. This passage is sad, yes, but I also think it's important because this is really the moment where Gregor lets it go. And he finally sort of admits to himself that this is what he needs and this is what he wants. He finally allows himself to sort of be him and get the nourishment that he had been craving and not getting in his isolation and his anxiety and his sadness. This musical performance by his sister brings it out of him, and he can't help but crawl into that room and continue to get closer to her. But unfortunately, it goes about as well as you would expect. One of the renters sees him and points at him and screams and freaks out. They end up trying to back out of the contract and not pay the family, and now the family is freaking out. They're going to lose a source of income, and it really becomes the final straw for the family. In what feels like really the ultimate betrayal, now even his sister turns on him, and she wants to be rid of him. In some absolutely brutal passages, Kafka describes it saying, quote, "Dear parents," his sister said, striking the table by way of preamble, "things cannot go on like this. Even if you two perhaps do not realize it, I most certainly do. I am unwilling to utter my brother's name before this creature, and therefore will say only, we have to try to get rid of it. We have done everything humanly possible to care for it and show it tolerance. I don't think anyone would reproach us on this account." End quote. Later on, she says, quote, "It has to go. That's the only way, Father. You just have to try to let go of the notion that this thing is Gregor. The real disaster is that we believed this for so long. But how could it be Gregor? If it were Gregor, it would have realized a long time ago that it just isn't possible for human beings to live beside such a creature, and it would have gone away on its own. We still would have been lacking a brother, but we would have been able to go on living and honoring his memory. But now we have this beast tormenting us. It drives away our lodgers and apparently intends to take over the entire apartment and have us sleep in the gutter." End quote. Gregor, hearing all of this and again not being able to communicate anything of his own, is obviously crushed and destroyed by what his sister is saying, and he has a final devastating walk of shame back to his room. Quote, "Perhaps I'll be allowed to turn around now," Gregor thought, and resumed his labors. He could not entirely suppress the wheezing this exertion produced, and now and then he had to rest. Otherwise, no one was harassing him. He had been left to attend to matters on his own. When he had completed this rotation, he immediately made straight for the door to his room. He was astonished at how great a distance separated him from his destination, and he didn't understand how, weak as he was, he had been able to traverse the same distance just a little while before, almost without noticing. Steadfastly concentrating only on crawling as quickly as possible, he scarcely paid any heed to the fact that not a word, not a cry came from his family to disturb him. Only when he was already in the doorway did he turn his head. Not all the way around, as he felt his neck growing stiff, but even so he was able to see that all was unchanged behind him, except that his sister had risen to her feet. The last thing he saw was a glimpse of his mother, who had now fallen entirely asleep. End quote. It feels like the ultimate betrayal here, especially by his sister Greta. It's a very human moment. Probably most of us haven't been betrayed in this type of situation. Obviously, none of us has been turned into a bug, but we've probably all felt this sense of betrayal and that feeling in the pit of the stomach that you get. And I think Kafka does an amazing job here of just describing, explaining what it feels like when just the wind gets knocked out of your sails, especially when it's coming from someone that you had previously loved or trusted. In Gregor's final moments, he goes back to his room, sadly locked away again, and amazingly, he still agrees with his family that he doesn't want to cause them any pain or distress, and he realizes the burden that he is inflicting upon them, at least in their view, and he dies. Obviously, a sad conclusion to the story, but it actually doesn't end there, because there's still a couple of pages where Kafka describes what happens to the family, and they actually seem to be relieved. They get to go back to normal, and they get to go about their business, and they're now starting to realize how great they have it without having to deal with Gregor. And the book ends with Kafka having them realize and describe how great they have it. He says, quote, "Then all three of them left the apartment together, something they had not done for months, and took the electric tram all the way to the open countryside at the edge of town. The car in which they sat all alone was entirely suffused with warm sunlight. Cozily leaning back in their seats, they discussed their future prospects. And on closer investigation, it appeared that these prospects were not bad at all, for all three of their positions, something they had never before properly discussed, were in fact quite advantageous, and above all offered promising opportunities for advancement. The greatest immediate improvement in their situation, of course, would be easily achieved by moving to a new apartment. They now wished to take a smaller and cheaper, but more convenient, and above all more practical flat than their current one, which had been picked out for them by Gregor. As they were conversing in this way, Herr and Frau Samsa were struck almost as one while observing their daughter, who was growing ever more vivacious, by the thought that despite all the torments that had made her cheeks grow pale, she had recently blossomed into a beautiful, voluptuous girl. Growing quieter now, and communicating with one another almost unconsciously by an exchange of glances, they thought about how it would soon be time to find her a good husband. And when they arrived at their destination, it seemed to them almost a confirmation of their new dreams and good intentions when their daughter swiftly sprang to her feet and stretched her young body." End quote. So that is how the Metamorphosis ends, and the question becomes, what does it mean? First of all, I think it's just an interesting story, and I think the premise and in particular the opening line really draw in a potential reader, and this story has stood the test of time in popular culture, I think, because of that. This idea of being turned into a bug is fascinating, and as I said in the first episode of this series, I think we can all relate to thinking about being something else or being someone else. This idea of change, whether it's gradual or sudden, obviously weaves its way throughout the story, whether that's Gregor's change or, as some people point out, perhaps this story is about the metamorphosis of Greta. Initially, the sister is seemingly shy and really not all that interesting, but as Kafka makes very clear in that final paragraph, the ordeal has changed Greta into a better, more beautiful, and more formidable person. Of course, this comes at the expense of maybe her humanity, and obviously as the reader, we look at her really almost like the ultimate villain in her betrayal of Gregor at the end. So you have a bit of a hideous and dead caterpillar thing that ultimately turns into a beautiful butterfly that is Greta, and that's something that people have pointed out. Another theme that I tried to weave through the podcast series here is this idea of being spiritually hungry. In the modern world, there's lots of your time and your attention being spent on the mundane, the boring, the ordinary, the day-to-day, working a job, paying rent, dealing with debt, producing results, interpreting data. And in this modern world, there might be less time for more spiritual pursuits, arts and creative pursuits, things that are going to fill your life with meaning and joy and happiness. In the story, Gregor is mentioned to be a woodworker. This seems to be something that he enjoys, and he puts that picture in the frame that he created. And it's just this one small little thing, and it's really the only thing in the whole story that gives any indication of a spiritual or meaningful or happiness-based pursuit that he does. And I think one reason this story has stood the test of time is that a lot of readers can probably identify with the trappings of the modern lifestyle. Another avenue to interpret the story is this idea of the expression of yourself. At no point in the story is Gregor really ever able to be who he is and express himself in a coherent or connective manner with any of the other characters in the story. Gregor's inability to communicate causes incredible problems, obviously, in his life. And you could certainly make this analogy to people who have trouble expressing themselves and feel as if they're trapped in a life that is not their own. Speaking of being trapped in a insect's body, there's actually some debate in the translation world about whether or not he was actually transformed into an insect, or did Kafka really mean to have him transformed into some sort of rodent or verminous sort of weird hybrid monster thing. Susan Bernofsky, who translated the version of the Metamorphosis that I read, talks about the word that Kafka uses for the monster, and the German word here is Ungeziefer. Hope I'm pronouncing that right, but anyway, she says, quote, "The word in German suggests primarily six-legged critters, though it otherwise resembles the English word vermin, which refers primarily to rodents. Ungeziefer is also used informally as the equivalent of bug, though the connotation is dirty, nasty bug. You wouldn't apply the word to cute, helpful creatures like ladybugs. In my translation, Gregor is transformed into some sort of monstrous insect with some sort of added to blur the borders of the somewhat too specific insect. I think Kafka wanted us to see Gregor's new body and condition with the same hazy focus with which Gregor himself discovers them." End quote. Bernofsky also points out right there this idea of a hazy focus that permeates through the story. She says, quote, "I am far from certain that Kafka himself, with his penchant for the blurred perceptions of bewilderment, was much concerned with the apartment's precise geography. How many rooms does this apartment have? Many, too many. Just as Gregor, lying on his back in the story's opening sentences, discovers he has these many little legs waving in the air above him, both are physical correlatives of a life that has gotten out of hand. Kafka is not even particularly attentive to the continuity of his cast and characters. Early on in the story, we see the maid give notice and flee, only to find her still working in the household several pages later, and in fact doing all the cooking, since now it is the cook who quit. Except for the charwoman who plays a starring role in the penultimate scenes, the household help is just part of the furniture of the story, like the cabinet that gets shifted to another room." End quote. So I think what Bernofsky is pointing out there is that there is this element of mystery and fogginess and haziness that is there in the story, and it leaves certain things open for interpretation. What was Gregor really transformed into? Why did he become that way? Are all of us in some way Gregor? Whether it's slow, gradual, or sudden and abrupt change, we all go through it. Some people see this story in a more personal way in terms of this is how we treat the sick or people who are struggling with their mental health or people who are depressed. Some people look at this story as a commentary on aging and how we treat the elderly in our societies. Oftentimes, convenience and routine are important to humanity, and when those things get interrupted, sometimes convenience can be the enemy of compassion. Much like the family in the story, I think Kafka wants us to ask if it's ever simply a relief just to be rid of someone who is suffering on the inside. I think he's holding up a mirror to modern society, forcing us to think about how we treat the lowest and most disregarded members of our society. Much like Gregor, they may be bugs now, but in the past, perhaps they weren't always that way. And perhaps that humanity, much like Gregor's humanity, is still there inside of him, but it's just ignored by, again, those who favor convenience over compassion. So it turns out that this story of a man who turns into a bug sheds important light on human nature and how we all change and how we all long for a past that is gone. And it reminds us, I think, to hold on to the humanity that is inside all of us and to recognize it in all of those around us as well. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe on Patreon for bonus episodes and other perks. You can also join the Patreon for free to get a monthly recommendations email and a sneak peek at what's up next. You can support in other ways, of course, by leaving a rating or review in your podcast app, by following on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, etc., by sharing with a friend, or simply by continuing to listen. You can also sign up for the email newsletter that I've been working on. Links to all of this stuff are in the show notes. Any comments or suggestions you can send to reflectinghistory@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. As always, that's it for now.